This episode of the podcast is brought to you by KC Consulting.
There's no doubt that social media marketing is challenging, and it's especially challenging when operating a business in cannabis. In most cases, you're one post away from your brand's account being shut down by Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube for violating its quote-unquote community guidelines. Fortunately, KC Consulting, the premier social media marketing agency based in Dallas, Texas, is committed to helping cannabis companies navigate through the uncharted waters of social media marketing and advertising. The agency specializes in strategy, content creation, channel management, paid advertising, graphic design, and SEO services that will take your social media marketing efforts to the next level. Give them a call at 972-310-7471 or shoot them an email at social@kcconsulting.co today to schedule a free discovery call with the agency's owner and lead consultant, me, Kevin Carrillo. Again, the number is 972-310-7471 and the email is social@kcconsulting.co. Add value, not noise. KC Consulting. Hello, my fellow people of the plant. Kevin Carrillo here, and welcome to another episode of the Cannabinoid Connect podcast. My guest today is Anthony Pompliano, host of the Pomp Podcast. Powerful Pompliano, thanks for coming on, man. I'm excited to talk with you today.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, man. It's going to be so interesting conversation because, obviously, if people don't know that are listening who Anthony Pompliano is, he's the host of the Pomp Podcast, which is one of the most popular podcasts in business and investing. And you talk with a lot of interesting people in business, finance, and of course, Bitcoin. So I'm really, really interested to talk to you today about your perspective of industry leaders that you've talked to in the cannabis industry, the psychedelic industry. And then, of course, I want you to take the floor at the end with Bitcoin and kind of help educate some of my listeners in terms of the opportunities that Bitcoin presents.
Let's do it, man. I'm super excited. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Yeah. So before we dive into anything first, Anthony, I do want to talk to you. I know that you and I both got married last year during the pandemic. So I want to ask you, like, were your plans kind of messed up and you had to reschedule, or was it kind of just off the whim you went and ended up getting married, or kind of what was your experience with that?
No, we were gonna get married in April, and then got pushed back to July. At the time, April 1st, when we moved it back, it didn't seem like everything would still be going on in July. Miscalculated that one, and so we ended up then postponing it again. And we said, look, we're just gonna go get married by ourselves. And so my wife, myself, got married. My brother was going to be the officiant or the priest, so that was easy. And we actually enjoyed kind of doing it that way. So would highly recommend it.
Nice. Yeah. Congratulations. That's funny. You said that your initial date was in the April timeframe, because that was the same as ours. And so it was such a weird time to see, the lockdowns and everything hit at the end of March. And then we're kind of just on pins and needles waiting to see travel and all that kind of stuff. So we ultimately had to reschedule as well for the September timeframe in Mexico, but it ended up working out great. We had a lot of people show up. So it was good, man. So I'm glad we survived that,
Absolutely.
Yeah. So Pomp, let's dive right in, man. I know, again, like I mentioned, you're talking to high caliber industry leaders in different markets, right? So I want to get a feel for what you've learned and kind of who you've talked to first in the cannabis space.
Yeah, I feel like I've had a bunch of people on who have done different things in the cannabis space, like nobody who necessarily is just dedicated to cannabis. I've had everyone from Eliza Orleans, who is running for Manhattan District Attorney, who really talked a lot about like decriminalization and kind of all the drug-related offenses. I've had on Ronan Levy, who is now the CEO of Field Trip, which is in the psychedelic space, but he did a bunch of work in the cannabis space. I've had on, let's see who else, Christian Agermeyer with Thai, and he's done a couple of things there. So I feel like I've just had a lot of different folks on who have touched the space, and it's been pretty interesting to kind of learn about it.
Right. And well, I would assume that cannabis is not foreign to you, whether you've used it in the past or if you've been around it. Has there been anything that's really surprised you or shocked you, especially with the momentum that the cannabis industry is seeing last year and this year?
Yeah, I think that it's just a foregone conclusion, right? You've got the individual states who are basically saying, "Hey, look, we're going to make this thing legal, or we're going to decriminalize it." And that started with one state doing it, and then more states did it. Now it's becoming like pretty obvious that that's going to happen. Even in the state of New York, now they're talking about it. And so it's just a question of like, when does it happen at the federal level? I don't necessarily have an opinion on like timeline. I don't really pay that much attention to it. But to me, I think that's the big shift that's occurred over the last couple of years. Is this basically went from drugs are bad and people who do drugs are like bad people, to now it's like, oh, of course this is going to be legal. It's just a matter of time.
Right. Yeah, it's funny how the perception has changed, right? Like as you mentioned, we kind of grew up in the era of dare where, drugs are bad, people who do drugs are low lives and there's, scumbags or whatever kind of the label they'd put on them. But it's funny that we're seeing now cannabis kind of being more studied and seeing the different cannabinoids and their effects on the human body, right? I mean, you have the THC cannabinoid that's very psychoactive, gets you high, used for creativity, recreation, or of course medical. But then you have CBD and other cannabinoids where they're starting to understand how these cannabinoids are interacting with our endocannabinoid system and really marrying with those CB1 and CB2 receptors. So what's been surprising for me is that we're inherently biologically married with this plant, and I could argue the same for psychedelics in terms of mental illness, PTSD and others. So let's also talk about psychedelics. You mentioned you talked with Ronan Levy. You've talked with Compass Pathways CEO George Goldsmith. So what did you kind of take away from those conversations?
Yeah, so I think I've had on, let's see, I've had on Ronan, I've had on Christian Agermeyer, I've had on Kevin O'Leary, who is a investor in MindMed, with CEO JR there, George Goldsmith, and there might be one or two others that I've had on. Mike Novogratz is super into kind of psychedelics, ayahuasca, things like that. And I think the main takeaway is pretty simple. Like, there is a very strong argument that there is a medical use case for this type of plant, or these type of chemical compounds. And it is likely that whether it is in the United States or elsewhere, there is going to be a legal and regulatory framework that will allow people to indulge in this at the kind of oversight of some sort of medical professional. And look, I'm not a scientist, so what the science says and doesn't says, that's for somebody who's better educated on that stuff. For me, I just look at it as there's a lot of smart people flowing to that specific asset. There's a lot of capital flowing there, and everything that I've read from a regulatory and legal perspective appears to kind of have the same directional bias, which is this is going to move from something that is highly illegal and highly looked down upon to something that is more accepted, especially through that perspective of the medical field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when you talk about the efficacy and the science behind it, that's of course those studies and whatnot are still kind of catching up due to the federal regulation that has been put on these medicines or these drugs. I don't like to say that word, but the people that I've talked to, one in particular, Ty Burgess. I mean, this guy was a former hospital CEO who became really ill with an autoimmune disease, chronic pain, and he was prescribed over like 15 medications. Of course, opioids were the majority of those. And in those years of being on those medications, he admitted saying, like, there's one point I just felt like I wanted to die. And what's amazing about his story is that he went to an Ibogaine clinic in Mexico. Are you familiar with Ibogaine?
I am not. What is that?
So Ibogaine is the root of the iboga plant, and it's from the Bowetie tribe in South Africa. And basically, what they're saying that Ibogaine does is it treats addictive tendencies or addiction, right? So people that are heavily addicted to heroin or opioids, this medicine basically kind of fills the hole of the opioid receptor in your brain that may have been tarnished by abuse. So in his experience, and these there's multiple clinics in Mexico because it's legal there. he went there and they kind of do a whole kind of spiritual thing where they have him take the root, and he goes through all that process. And he said, I mean, almost immediately he had this sense of awareness where he no longer needed to be reliant on those drugs and whatnot. And so it was kind of like an overnight effect. So again, just hearing these testimonials are very, very interesting, and it makes sense when you say that more capital is flowing to these markets, more smart people are gravitating toward it, because it seems to be something that's working, right?
Absolutely. And I also think that there's this very interesting, kind of perspective that people need to have, which is when you're investing, right? My whole thesis is like, go look at the fringes of society and basically try to find the things that are contrarian today that will be consensus tomorrow. Like that's it, right? And that's not rocket science. Like there's a lot of people who understand that. It just takes somebody who really, really believes that to have the stomach and courage to go actually to the fringes of society and find the things that aren't yet acceptable, right? And so like if you were looking at psychedelics 2 years ago, like you're probably sitting in a pretty good spot today, right? If you were looking at Bitcoin and crypto 2-3 years ago, you were probably sitting in a pretty good spot today. And so it's just thinking about like, okay, what's like the next thing that potentially could go from contrarian idea to consensus idea, and being able to have the courage and conviction to kind of be ahead of the trend. I think whether it's psychedelics or other things, like that's basically the way that I think about investing.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, that contrarian view and to shift over is difficult at first. I know in my own experience, even launching this podcast, I mean, I have a corporate background, right, in marketing, and so the stigma attached to cannabis and even psychedelics is still rampant, right, in some cases. So that was difficult for me to switch over. But once you're in, as you said, these industries are starting to emerge, and it's becoming less stigmatized because it's becoming legitimized, right? We're starting to see use cases and smarter people enter in. And so are you surprised with the pace of public support with the psychedelic market compared to the cannabis market? Or do you see them both the same?
I don't understand nor have the information in front of me of like which one is getting more or less capital flows. What I will say is one big difference is, and Kevin O'Leary really highlighted this for me, was in the psychedelic space, it's basically all medicinal right now, right? And that's the belief, is that it's going to get the medicinal approval, and that's going to be the focus. It's unlikely that it'll actually get into more of kind of the retail markets. With cannabis, obviously, there's been a huge focus on both medicinal and retail. Some people will argue that having the focus of both means it's a bigger market opportunity and there's more money to be made. Others will argue that by only having a medicinal focus in the psychedelic space, it's more likely to have like clearer regulatory kind of framework on a shorter timeline. I don't know which one's the right answer. I think that I understand both arguments, but that's the big difference right now, is just that one seems to be only medicinal and the other seems to be retail and medicinal. And so we're going to see kind of how that plays out. But again, I think that cannabis is going to be legal. I think that psychedelics in a medicinal setting will be legal, and so you're going to see capital flow to both industries.
Outside of the perspective of capital flow into these markets, regarding the pace, like, are you surprised from a state and local government standpoint? I mean, we're seeing Colorado, Oregon starting to legalize psilocybin therapy for, again, mental illness and addiction and PTSD. So like the fact that they're so willing to open the floodgates and start experimenting with these psychedelics compared to other states that have been more hesitant for cannabis, is that surprising? Or again, is it kind of just, that contrarian, like, it's just moving at the pace in which it's naturally destined to?
I think that it's not necessarily contrarian as much as it is, it's an important milestone for people to pay attention to, right? It's basically saying like, look, once you start getting into decriminalization, now that's one step closer to legalization. And so you're going to start to see kind of that trend. It's going to go from illegal to maybe we're not going to actually, criminalize it, to then we're going to actually make it legal. And so as you see that transition starting to happen, of course, it's going to happen in the places you would expect first, people who kind of have a more Democrat leaning or liberal leaning city. They tend to be much more kind of open-minded about that stuff versus some of the more Republican type, economies and cities. And so naturally, if you see it starting in one or two cities, like look what happened with cannabis, it's going to eventually kind of permeate across the country. Just takes time. People got to be patient. But I think that, again, it's a foregone conclusion that it happens.
Right, yeah, and that you're right about the kind of process in which it's welcome into a state, right? You're first starting with decriminalization, then you move to medicinal, and then ultimately adult use or recreation. And we're seeing that now in Texas. The Texas legislature met for their session this past week, and there's 5 priorities on the docket for this year, and marijuana is one of them, and that is to expand their medical program. So even states like Texas, which is of course known as being red and more conservative, I think that some of these policymakers are seeing not only the medicinal benefits but the economic and even the environmental benefits of that. And so one other question regarding, or a couple more questions regarding cannabis is, what have you heard in terms of the potential for industrial hemp? Now, I know that this is really in its infancy, but when I talk about industrial hemp, I mean, growing the plant for fiber and hurd to, make material goods out of, because there's multiple applications for hemp, right? You can biofuels, plastics, houses, even clothes. So do you think that will be another kind of way for entry into these states and even the federal government if they can regulate it the right way?
I know nothing about that, so I'd love to learn more, but I know literally nothing about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, so Market Watch and of course Forbes, I mean, they put up these projections of the cannabis market, right? And it's anywhere from I think 24 to 27 billion, but they're not taking into account the industrial hemp side. And states like Texas, New Mexico that have lots of land mass, they're in prime position to grow outdoor, pull that plant, that stock right out of the ground, put it in a decorticator where it separates the fiber hurd. And as I mentioned, all the applications that you can make out of them. So it's just interesting to see that these publications aren't really accounting for that. And again, this market is in its infancy because the infrastructure is not in place, the supply chain is not there. But when it is, I mean, I think that is going to be a huge game changer in terms of possibly challenging legacy industries or even replacing in legacy industries.
Yeah, and to me, guess part of this too is like once you start down the path of an industry being acceptable, then what you start to see also is like, okay, what are all the sub industries that are built off of it? So this sounds very similar to that, right? It's like once you get kind of the mainstream thing through, then there's all sorts of second and third order effects. And so if people can find uses for whether it's kind of the ancillary products or other kind of monetization or business models, I think it's just a foregone type situation where people are going to do it. So it makes a lot of sense. And I wasn't really aware of that before.
Right. Yeah. And just to close this point here is that, I think that a lot of the prohibition against cannabis, starts dating back to the 1930s was not that, the angle they took was the reefer madness. They kind of blamed minority populations, that this was a bad drug and they were doing bad things because they were taking it. But really, I think the ultimate thing was it was a threat to industry, because before the 1930s, as humans, we consumed hemp and used hemp for many different things in our daily lives. So I mean, from the books I've read and the people that I've talked to, I think that's really the core of prohibition at this point. But again, as people are becoming more open-minded and public support is getting there and policymakers are open to it, I think that will change, in the years to come. At least here's to hoping, right? So,
Absolutely.
go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think that you've got the right mentality about it. I'm just trying to think through kind of on the fly, what are all the different ways that an entrepreneur looking at this space could basically say, hey, there's one kind of major transition that's underway. How do I capitalize off of the second order effects? And I mean, literally everything from like physical retail stores to online sales to building kind of ancillary products to saying, hey, look, I'm going to create services rather than physical goods or products, to also saying, hey, I'm going to package together and kind of bundle services with goods. Like there's there's just so many different things that the right entrepreneur could figure out if they're interested in the space.
Yeah, it's very exciting time to be in the space. Last point to touch on is the environmental benefits, which I'm not sure you're aware of, but from the people I've talked to, the books I've read, is that growing hemp is one of the best things that you can do for the environment because of how much CO2 the plant brings in, right? And it also enriches the soil. So I've had one farmer on that was talking about, if you want to grow anything organic, first grow hemp, because that's what really cleans the soil, gets rid of all those pesticides and all that, all that kind of bad stuff, and really enriches to produce an organic product that is high quality. So again, I just want to reiterate, there are so many economic, medicinal, and environmental benefits that make it so excited to play in the space at this point.
Yeah, and I think that that's another piece of it too, is having people really understanding and educated. Right? It's very similar to like crypto, Bitcoin, where there's an education gap, and if you can get people educated, then their opinion changes. I feel like this is the exact same thing.
It's similar. It is. Yeah. Cause I mean, I'm watching your social media and your podcast, and it's really just trying. I mean, I know what you're doing. You're a champion of Bitcoin, and you're trying to educate people around the value of it compared to our legacy, transactional systems that we have in place now. So one more point to touch on, and then I want to give you the floor and really educate our audience about Bitcoin. But in terms of the market, Pomp, are you following any specific cannabis companies at this point? And if not, I mean, are you open to hearing some of the ones that I'm following and others in the industry?
I'm not. I have kind of taken this perspective of like, I know my circle of competence. It is not in the cannabis industry. I've got a lot of friends who spend a lot of time there, and so whenever I need to learn something, I basically ask them. But other than that, I'm kind of more of a observer from afar.
Got you. Okay. Yeah. No, that's fair enough, man. I mean, it's good to kind of just stay in your core, and then of course branch out and talk to people and learn, but you don't ever want to step outside of what you're comfortable with, right? In terms of investing and speaking knowledge. So I appreciate that. So Pomp, why don't you go ahead, man? I mean, I've done my research. I'll tell you, just to kind of kick things off, I did watch your YouTube video entitled "What is Bitcoin and Why is it Important?" to do my initial research, and it was very helpful. I'll tell you that. So why don't you just kind of go ahead at a high level and explain what Bitcoin is, why it's important, the value of Bitcoin, and why should we be focused on this asset?
Yeah, look, I think Bitcoin is, in its simplest terms, is the decentralized digital currency, which just means it's money. It's just in a new technology form factor. It's got a different monetary policy, but it's just money. And there's a lot of advantages to it that we can get into. But really, the big kind of aha is nobody controls it. Nobody can create more of it. And you don't have to trust a third party. You don't have to trust a bank. You don't have to trust the government. You don't have to trust anyone in order to transact, to pay for goods and services or send it or receive it. And so ultimately, it is this very resilient system that is being used globally by over 100 million people. It's grown to now be around a $700 billion asset class. And I think that it's kind of just starting really in terms of the adoption on a global scale.
And let's talk about the transparency component of that, because I mean, as you mentioned, it's a decentralized system as opposed to our legacy systems that have a third party, right? So let's really get into it. It's like, I know there's Bitcoin miners that are releasing Bitcoin that's available. There's only how many, 21 million total that's available right now, or?
21 million total is the total supply, and then about 18.6 million is the circulating supply.
Okay. And so, and the Bitcoin miners are incentivized to process these transactions because they're being paid in Bitcoin, but every 4 years, the amount of Bitcoin that they receive lessens, right?
Yes, correct. So there's something called the Bitcoin halving. Think of it as the 21 million Bitcoin were created. They're distributed into the market on a predetermined frequency. So it was 50 Bitcoin every 10 minutes for 4 years. Then after 4 years, that cut from 50 Bitcoin every 10 minutes down to 25. Then for 4 years, it was 25 Bitcoin per 10 minutes. After 4 years of that, it got cut down in half again to 12 and a half, and then 4 years, and then it got cut to 6.25 again. So the last one happened in May 2020. And that'll continue for 4 years, and then it'll get cut again in half. And so I think that it's a pretty interesting, kind of beautifully designed system, because not only is it transparent, but also it's programmatic, meaning that you already know kind of how it's going to work, and you can see and check and make sure that it's actually working the way that that it was intended to.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, you got to be living under a rock if you haven't heard the boom and the explosion and the traction that Bitcoin has been seeing over the last year, right, or even longer, especially the most recent months. And so, like, every day I'm looking at your Twitter, and it's like, 28,000, 29,000, 30,000. So, like, talk to us a little bit about why people are gravitating to this and what they're seeing as the benefit, as opposed to our legacy currency, which is the USD dollar.
Yeah, look, it protects your purchasing power. So if you think of the US dollar, you're guaranteed to lose purchasing power over time. And with Bitcoin, you're guaranteed to gain purchasing power over time. It's really that simple. And I think that people are waking up to the fact that it serves as this fantastic savings technology. You can save in Bitcoin and do better over a long period of time than if you save in dollars. And so I think that's attractive to a lot of people, and they're trying to figure out how do they just save more and more in the asset.
Mm-hmm. And then one more thing to touch on in terms of transparency is actually going and looking at the transaction that happened, right? So from my understanding, again, watching that awesome video that you put out, what is Bitcoin and why it is important, I encourage y'all to check it out on Pomp's YouTube channel if you haven't. But that is the transparency of being able to go back every 10 minutes and see the transaction that was placed. And there's just simply a number to that transaction, right, that you look up.
Correct. You can basically go on, you can look at every single transaction that's ever been done on the system, and you can understand not only what's happening at the monetary policy level, making sure that only 900 Bitcoin a day are being created right now, but you also can see every single transaction. So I describe it as kind of Monopoly. If you sit down to play Monopoly, everyone sits down at the table, you got 4 people, there's a bank, but it's off to the side, and there's no dedicated banker. And the reason why the game of Monopoly works, even though there's not a banker, is that everyone can see every transaction. So I pay you, you pay me, I pay the bank pays you, right? All those transactions can be seen by everybody. And so by having transparency, you end up actually having the verification that the stuff happened, and therefore people trust the system. And what's really interesting about it is if you play with a little kid puts the money underneath the table, all of a sudden everyone's like, whoa, put the money back on the table. Like you think they're cheating, right? And so that's essentially how a blockchain works. It just does it in an automated fashion, but it basically puts every single transaction out in the open for anyone to see, and allows you to audit or verify at any time, which ultimately people now are obviously finding a lot of value in.
It makes so much sense, right? I mean, when you put that example of Monopoly, I mean, that's very straightforward how that game is played, right? But it seems like, of course, with governmental intervention and different things, like things become very complex and muddy, right? So talk to me about the pushback from the government when it comes to Bitcoin. And even like I have Bloomberg on every day, and they're talking about all these different stocks and assets, but like they hate on Bitcoin. I could just tell their tone. They don't really understand it. They don't give much recognition to it. And so why is that? Like what is the threat to them?
Yeah, look, I think that one, they just don't understand the asset. They haven't taken the time to learn. Like that's a huge piece of it. 2 is their incentives are for it not to work, right? They have a system that is pretty great. They're middlemen. They are able to extract value by being a middleman. And so they are going to have to be in a weird position and have to adapt if this ends up being successful. And then the third and probably the most important thing is it's the fear of the unknown, right? It's like, hey, look, if I don't understand this thing and I think I might, it might be detrimental to me, then I'm actually best off just saying, screw it. And I don't want this thing to succeed. And I'll just go on television and say whatever I want. And so I think that, when people get educated about it, though, they kind of flip very quickly. This guy, Michael Saylor, who used to be a Bitcoin bear, very quickly decided after educating himself, wait a second, this is going to be really, really impactful. And he literally went and put over $1 billion of his company's balance sheet into Bitcoin. He then took a $225 million purchase for himself. So the guy owns, just on the purchase price, I think it's like 1.2, $1.3 billion worth of Bitcoin, and has done pretty well for himself. But I think that's a prime example of somebody who didn't believe, took the time, learned about it, and then flipped and became, kind of the ultra volt. And I think that as more and more people educate themselves, you'll see that happen more and more often.
Yeah, and that example is what we touched on earlier in terms of the similarities of the Bitcoin market and then the cannabis market. Like in that, like the pharmaceutical company, right, is kind of running the show at this point. We're seeing them, prescribe massive amounts of opioid medication, pain management medication, and when we talk about things like psychedelic therapy and cannabis as a medicine, they're kind of they hate on it a little bit. And of course, the peer review studies by the government, whatnot, kind of only cite the bad and the negative as opposed to the efficacy and what people are seeing in terms of testimonials. So again, there is that parallel that's very interesting as these new markets are emerging.
Absolutely. And I also think that, this alternative financial system is going to be really interesting, because really what you're going to get is you're going to get a decentralized, automated financial system that's digital by nature. And there's a lot of people who benefit from the bureaucracy of the legacy financial system. And so by creating more efficiency, you're actually hurting their business. And they're the ones who are most incentivized for it not to work. Right.
Right. Right. Yeah, I mean, we'll keep being a thorn in their side and keep educating people, because I mean, this is the new reality that we're living in, and you're doing a great job, Pomp. And tell us about the origin story of Bitcoin, which is pretty fascinating, right? I mean, we know of the founder's name, but we don't know who he is. Is that right?
Yeah, so Satoshi Nakamoto, it is a pseudonymous person or group. Nobody knows who created it. It kind of has this immaculate conception type story. And I think that's one of the strengths of it, right? You see with the large tech companies right now, everyone gets all upset and they call the tech company CEOs in and they say, hey, you got to come in and you got to answer to Congress. You are going to sanction you, or we're going to regulate you, and you're going to have all these issues. Well, with Bitcoin, you can't do that. There's no one to call in front of Congress. There's no CEO. There's no kind of headquarters. There's no single server to attack. And so I think that it's a really formidable position for Bitcoin to be in, is to not have all of that stuff as potential risks.
Right, right. No, that makes sense, man. Well, hey, I really appreciate your time, Pomp. I know that you're a busy guy. I don't know who you're interviewing next, the president or whatever, but keep up the great work, man. And I want to give you the floor before we sign off. Is there anything that you want to leave our audience with?
Yeah, look, I just think that people should take the time to learn, right? Like, obviously, as with anything, whether it's cannabis, psychedelics, Bitcoin, anything, don't invest in things you don't understand. And so the best investment you can make is just invest in yourself and educate yourself. I'm very fond of telling people that you should educate yourself, because nobody is coming to save you, right? Like, there is no one who's going to look out for you like you look out for yourself. And so just educate yourself, take the time, learn, be intellectually curious, make sure you understand things before you invest in them. But if you take that time and you learn about this stuff, you're willing to do work that other people aren't willing to do work, there's likely to be, a reward at the end of it if you make the right decisions.
100%. Well said, Pomp. Where can people find your podcast, you on social media, if they want to hear more of these bars that you drop every day?
I would just say that you can go to Twitter, right? Obviously, at a Pompliano. You could search Pomp Podcast in the podcast store. But probably the best resource is just go to the letter that I write every day. This newsletter. It's just pompletter.com. I try to kind of put everything that I'm putting out all in that email, so it's kind of one-stop shop. And then I also provide some opinion and analysis on a daily basis of kind of what's going on in the market.
Awesome, man. Well, hey, thanks again for your time, Pomp. Really appreciate it. And like I said, continue to blaze the trails, man. We'll be following you and watching your progress.
Absolutely. You're doing a great job, man. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. And thanks for listening. Bye, guys.